Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing on the Ukraine. We ask for peace in that area, and we pray most particularly for the Ukrainians who've been deported to Russia. Anyway, 51. It's God speaking. He says, "Listen to me, you who pursue saving justice, you who seek the Lord." And one of the powerful things in Jewish teaching is what is called this parallelism. In Jewish poetry, you don't rhyme. In Jewish poetry, you use parallel ideas. And if you look through, like the Psalms, you'll notice that. They say it one way and then they say it another way. But that's the way the Jewish poetry works. And that's what's going on here. He says, you who pursue saving justice and you who seek the Lord. And what he's basically saying is to pursue justice is to seek God. And to seek God is to pursue justice. The one who isn't pursuing justice is not seeking God. Just that simple. And so he says, look to the rock from which you were hewn, the quarry from which you were dug. And so he says, look to your ancestry, to your sources. One of the things I think is interesting is that at times of sources, you know, that we tend to be very, very idealistic. And one of the things, like, for instance, I've seen done on several retreats, like for priests that we go on, the man will say, remember the priest you thought you wanted to be on the day you were ordained. And I've done that on marriage things, like remember the husband you intended to be the day you were married, or the wife you intended to be the day you were married, before the miserable little children came along. And, or, you know, this sort of thing, to really look, and that's what he's calling them to do. And what is their source? Their source is Abraham. Like, remember Abraham's pursuit of God. Remember his absolute, commitment to God. He says, look to Abraham, your father, and Sarah, who gave you birth. Okay? Now, so that's the rock out of which they were hewn. Sarah and Abraham. And if you know that you could do that in many ways. In our ways, you could do it with regards to the church as being the rock out of which you were hewn. You could look at your ancestry, family, as being the rock out of which you were hewn. You could look at the country where you're raised as being the rock. There are all kinds of ways you can look at it, but to allow it to call us, you know, to be a better person. It said, when I called him, he was but one, but I blessed him and made him many. And I think you know that when God called Abraham, God promised he would have many descendants, everything. So Abraham went with God. But he reached the age of 100, both he and his wife, and they had no children at all. And God's saying here, but now look how many. Look how many are the Jewish people. And he's basically saying that I keep my promises, you know. And I think that's one of the wonderful things that St. Augustine really emphasizes in his text. He says some beautiful things about Last Judgment, but he says that one of the things that will begin with Last Judgment is when we're all gathered for Last Judgment, God will ask the question, can anyone name any promise I ever made that I did not keep? And Augustine says there will be silence, that no one will be able to do that. And he says you should remember that when you begin to question your own salvation. He promised to save you. He said, anyone who eats my body, drinks my blood, washed in the waters of baptism. I mean, there's all kinds of things. But these promises they're promises he's made, you know. And this idea of what God does, what God says, is exactly what he does. He said, for the Lord will have mercy on Zion, have mercy on all her ruins. Notice these are all these parallel lines. So at this point, the Jews are probably in Babylon or on one of their exiles, but probably Babylon. One of the things to know, I think I mentioned this about Isaiah. Isaiah was a very prominent prophet in the early days, and he moved through Jewish circles amazingly. He was like accepted in the royalty and everything, and accepted in the priesthood, and he just had a stature that was unbelievable. But a group of people gathered around him, and that group of people became known as the prophets. And they're oftentimes mentioned in the scripture. They were an actual organization. Incidentally, the descendants of the prophets are the Carmelite order. At the end of the Jewish era, when Christianity was spreading, those people were all on Mount Carmel. That's where they were there from the days of Isaiah. And they came into the Catholic Church as a group, and they carried on in the Carmelite order. But this idea of their being there, the prophecies of Isaiah cover about 350 years. And so what happens was, under the book of Isaiah, and there are actually 4 books, 1, 2, 3, 4 books of Isaiah that are all put together. We don't deal with them as separate books, as one. But they're the followers of Isaiah applying the prophecies of Isaiah to their own day. And that's what we see going on. That's why we see some of this, a lot of problems and then a resolution, a celebration, and then problems. But they're different points in history. And Isaiah's long dead at that time. But they apply the teachings of Isaiah to the thing, whatever the time is. So Zion now is in ruins. Jerusalem is in ruins. And he says that, that doesn't block God's mercy. And in the scriptures, we will often see like these cities rebuilt and all this sort of thing. But I think the idea is and it's because we're human beings, okay? Because we're human beings, our lifespan is a short thing. In the great frame of things, our lives are very short. And if God makes a promise of the greatness of the Ukraine, for instance, and we don't see it, the tendency is to think that it will not happen. But the fact of the matter is, the whole place could be destroyed and everyone killed, everything, and ultimately the Ukraine could become a great country from the few descendants of the people that are left and stuff like that. That these promises of God are promises to peoples, not just individuals. And that, again, you look at all the promises God made to the Jews, and you look at all the things that happened to them through history, yet you'd be hard-pressed to find any place in the world today where there aren't Jews. And the fact is that God keeps the promise, even though the difficulties and those things are there. He said, he will make her desert like Eden. He will have mercy on her ruins. Her wastelands will be like a garden of the Lord. And so this idea of the wastelands, when you, particularly a desert city, if you were to take a city like, let's say what would be a good one, Megiddo. Think a city like Megiddo. You have Megiddo in the desert. It's in Israel. And incidentally, Megiddo sits on the plain of Megiddo, and the word for the plain of Megiddo is Armageddon. That's the area, okay? So anyway, the town of Megiddo was there, and what they did was cultivate water and stuff like that out of wells, and outside Megiddo would extend farms. So like if you were a citizen in Megiddo, you would maybe get 10 feet, but you could farm that 10 feet as far as you could get your water to go. So that the whole city was divided up that way into these great things. But beyond that was desert. And in the desert you had lions, you had all kinds of things. But it was, desert out beyond that. But he says the desert itself will be like an Eden, which means that the land around them is practically going to be tropical for it to be better than the Eden. He says, joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of music. And the joy and gladness is fine, and the sound of music is good. But the thing that I think is really important here, he says there will be thanksgiving. And thanksgiving means they're thankful for what God has done. That they see what God has done. I think sometimes we're slow in the area of thanksgiving. That's not a strong area for us, and we should be more locked into this idea of thanksgiving and looking in our lives at what we have. This morning we were dealing with the epistle to James, and one of the things James says is, he says the source of all unhappiness is the desire for what you do not have. And if you think about it, it's true. But if you look at the other side of that, the source of happiness is rejoicing in what you have. And I think that one of the sad things is living in the United States, we are part of a society that is, because of advertisement, is focused on pointing out what we don't have and, getting us to buy it. But I'm always amazed that you can sit down to watch a movie in the evening with a bowl of buttered popcorn and a drink, and you're sitting there watching it, and by the end of the movie, you have discovered a deep and passionate need for something you didn't even know existed when you sat down because of the working of the advertisement through the thing. It's just, it's remarkable. But I think if you want happiness in your life, you have to have a way of somehow guarding against that. I remember specifically the first time this occurred to me, I was in Venice, and for sale in this store was a clear glass. Venice, there's wonderful glass in Venice because the island of Marina was right there where they do all the glasswork. But there's this transparent glass whale, and you can see inside the whale Jonah as a little figure inside the whale. Just beautiful thing. And I was looking at it. I think it was about $400. But anyway, I was looking at it, and I really felt God say to me, you don't have to own something to enjoy it, And the thing is that to learn, how to enjoy things. That is my personal, incidentally, love of Washington, D.C. I don't know how many of you have been to Washington, D.C., but all the Smithsonian museums are free, all of them. And you could go to Washington and spend 2 weeks and not get through all the Smithsonian institution. Because, like, for instance, we know what we see, the Smithsonian things, but the National Portrait Gallery belongs to the Smithsonian. The National Gallery of Art belongs to the Smithsonian. The Native American Museum belongs to the Smithsonian. The Black Museum, the Jewish Holocaust Museum, that's all belongs to the Smithsonian. And, you think you have access to everything there. If you're living there, you have access to all of that. The reason is because it belongs to the American people. But anyway, he says, pay attention to me, my people. Listen to me, my nation, for a law will come forth from me, and my judgments shall be a light for the peoples. So he says, I'm going to give a law, and that law will be a light for peoples. Now understand, when we think of law, just the nature of law in the way we encounter it, law tends to be prohibitive. So that when we think of laws, we think of speeding laws. So we think of, because that's the sort of laws that we end up breaking, okay, are those kinds of things. But that's not the way God's law is constructed. God's law is really based on what we are supposed to do. And the violation of God's law is when we don't do what we're called to do. And I think one of the problems with that is that when you have a situation, let's talk like about the persecution of the Muslims in the United States. But when you have a situation like that, the tendency to think is that I'm fine if I'm not persecuting the Muslims. And I'm not. I'm fine if I'm helping to prevent people from persecuting the Muslims, okay? And I think one of the things that this understanding of law greatly affects people when, like during the Holocaust, the Germans are really into legality, but they understand it in this way of what's prohibited. And God's law is never prohibitive. God's law is directive. And he calls us to do these things, and that's what we're supposed to be about. I don't know if many of you remember when I was first learning to drive in California, do you know there weren't really speed limits? The law in California was you had to drive at a reasonable and safe speed. And so, like, you went to court if you got a speeding ticket, and you had to be able to prove that you were driving at a safe and reasonable speed, or they had to prove that you weren't. And if they couldn't do that, then you wouldn't be under a trial or anything. And so this idea of understanding that God's law is a command, and so his judgment is the light that we're to follow. His judgment is to lead us in the way we live our lives. He says, "My saving justice is suddenly approaching. My salvation goes forth like a light." And so salvation and and his justice. I've done this before with you, so I apologize, but I really think people need to remember that in the Bible, they see light as a very positive thing, and they see darkness as negative. And the reason they do it is that if I were to divide this room in half and put half in darkness and the other in light, if I were to put a little tiny hole in the wall, everyone in the dark room could find that hole because light would come through. But in the lighted room, you wouldn't find it. And that's because darkness doesn't come through. And it's really interesting, like we live in a universe that is 90% dark with spots of light, yet we see every spot of light. And if you get enough light, the dark disappears. But you never get so much dark, the light will disappear. It doesn't happen that way. And so to understand that when God says that my law is light, he's talking about God's law has power. And God's law has the power to change us. And to the degree we follow that, God's law has the power to change society. To the degree it changes society, it can change the world. And this whole business of the power in God's law, not just, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other thing. I find the most dangerous aspect of religion is that it deals in prohibitions. And the reason why religion does that, to be honest, it's easy to point out prohibitions. It's like if I were to say, that we are forbidden to steal. Well, it's easy to find out you've stolen or you haven't stolen or anything. But if you go to God's law commands us to be poor. Because the Bible tells God's close to the poor, he takes care of the poor. So we're commanded to be poor. But who could ever say, I'm poor? You just can't do that. A really good example of that's the movie Schindler's List. In Schindler's List, if you remember, way at the end of the movie, when Schindler, the car picked him up, so they're going to get him away so he wasn't taken by the Russians. So they were getting Schindler out of there. And when Schindler got into his car, he looked at the ring he was wearing. He says, if I had sold this ring, I could have saved 4 more people. Do you remember that in the movie? That's, you look at everything he did, but in following God's law, you can never do it perfectly. That's the wonder of God's law, that anything you're doing, he could call you just a little further. And I think that's the nature of the law. And Schindler was following God's law, which was saving the lives. Now, if you started killing people, you kill so many or you don't kill so many, so the prohibition against killing is easy to document. But did you save all you could? That can never be documented. That can never be documented. And I think that people who really pursue God's law, that's what prevents you from being proud. You can never do that perfectly. I remember when we began the changes after Vatican II, a lot of people would come to Mass and say, I have never touched the host. And so they wouldn't receive communion in the hand. Or I have never received from the cup. Or I have never eaten meat on Friday. I could actually go through a dozen of these. I've heard from different people at one time or another. And the fact of the matter is, that's easy to violate and to pick out. But if you read the document that dispensed with Friday, for instance, the document that dispensed with Friday abstinence in the church said that the abstinence from meat was not necessarily a penance for people. So it is the duty of people not so much to abstain from meat, but to find a penance. So we're obliged to find a penance. And it says if you cannot find a penance, abstain from the meat. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, where we live, it's hardly a burden to eat seafood. I mean, we have the best seafood in the world here. So that's not an issue at all. And one of the things I think is interesting in Israel, you have these, what do you call it? You can go in a meat restaurant and you'll have no dairy products at all. There's no cream for your coffee, no butter, nothing like that at all. And you can go in a fish restaurant, and in a fish restaurant, there's absolutely no meat. However, there's cheese, there's milk, there's cream, and if you go into the fish restaurant, you will not notice you're missing anything. But if you go into the meat restaurant, you will notice there's not whipped cream on your strawberries. We have so integrated milk into our system that you really can't do it. But I think it's very interesting. If you go the route of the fish, you wouldn't even notice you aren't eating meat. It's not a thing. But this idea of understanding God's law as a call and like a light. He says the coastlands, he says, my arm shall judge the peoples. The coastlands put their hope in me and their trust in my arm. To trust in someone's arm is their strength to defend you. Now, the coastlands in the text here normally refers to Greece. It refers to the islands off the northern Greek Isles. And the idea here is the Gentiles one day hearing God's call. And where we notice that most in the scriptures is with the number of centurions who were very involved with the Jewish faith. That's how they got into the Christian faith, that they were participating in the synagogues, and when Paul was preaching the Christian faith, they would take that. In the days of Jesus, particularly in Israel itself, you could not convert to Judaism. It was a nationality, so that they didn't accept converts. They did in the diaspora, but not in Israel proper. And so the centurions used to stay in the Jewish synagogue. There's a vestibule, much like we have in our churches. Then the thing, and the Gentiles could not go into the synagogue, but they could be in the vestibule. And the people that were very strong on that were the centurions. And the centurions recognized the truth of what was going on. The centurions were probably the best in the army. I don't know if I've explained to you that if you come into the army as a grunt, you could rise to be a centurion, okay? above a centurion was basically all royalty. So like if you were one of the major families in Rome and you decided to join the army, you joined as a general, and that's where you go. So the best people were the ones who'd risen to the level of centurion. A centurion couldn't go above unless he became a Roman citizen, and you couldn't, you could buy that, but it took a lot of money. So anyway, so they began to see it. And he says, they will trust in him. He says, raise your eyes to the heavens and look down at the earth beneath. For the heavens will vanish like smoke. The earth will wear out like a garment. Its inhabitants will die like vermin. But my salvation will last forever, and my saving justice will never be scattered. But he says, as you look, he says that the heavens, like fog, it's going to disappear. And the earth is going to be destroyed. And people living on the earth are going to be destroyed. We expect we'll be destroyed either by age or whatever, but ultimately we're destroyed. But what goes on is God's law. And that's why we need to participate in God's law. Now, in the Jewish tradition, that's seen as participation in God's law. In our tradition, it's seen more in reference to baptism and the resurrection of Jesus. But the Jews had never seen the resurrection of Jesus. They were called to this eternity that they never quite understood, most of them, as the idea of living forever, that you would be carried on in the Jewish nation, your genes would go on, that sort of thing. That all kinds of ways of looking at it. But with Jesus, it became, yes, it's going to be a new heavens, a new earth, and a new you. That's all going to happen. And but it just becomes an explicitation of what the Jewish scriptures are talking about in the law. That the law is supposed to guarantee our continuance. And it goes on in this way. So, he says, listen to me, you who know what saving justice is, a people who take my law to heart. Okay, so he calls me, he says, listen to him if we're the ones who take God's law to heart and allow God to guide us in what we're doing. And again, don't think of it as prohibition. Look at what God's calling us to do. And I take Francis of Assisi. God called Francis to poverty, okay? He didn't call him to give up anything. He just called him to poverty. And in pursuing poverty, he gave up things. And I think human life is a matter of pursuing things, and when you pursue things, you give up things. Like I remember someone talking to me about celibacy and saying, I cannot imagine anyone giving up in their life the sexual relations with a woman. And he says, think of all the women you've given up. I said, to be honest, you've only given up one less than I have. The fact of the matter is, that to be a part of anything, you have to give up something, everyone. And St. Augustine uses a good one too. He says that in a restaurant, the only way you can keep all the possibilities of ordering in your presence is to starve to death. Because if you want to eat, you have to give up a bunch of them. You pick one and give up the others. But until you do that, you don't eat, And but you don't think in a restaurant, you never think about what you're giving up, Again, when you get married, you don't think about who you're giving up. You think about who you're marrying, and this sort of thing. But this idea that we should be that way with God's law, see where he's calling us to, and we give up things in pursuing it. Because I think in terms of giving up things, life becomes very hard because you're looking at what you've given up, and you want to look at what you've got and be happy for what you've got and not desirous of what you don't, just like it says earlier. He says, do not fear people's taunts. Do not be dismayed by their insults. For the moth will eat up their clothing, the worm will devour them like wool, but my saving justice will last forever, and my salvation for all generations. And this idea of God's law being presented, and you follow it. And you can be ridiculed for following God's law, particularly if you say you are following his law. But I think, a lot of people follow God's law very successfully, and, people they just see the success of the life. They don't see kind of what's going on. And I've oftentimes quoted Bernstein's Mass to you, but there's a verse in Bernstein's Mass that comes from this, and he says, there are people who, talking about God's law, he says there are people who doubt it and shout it out loud. They are local vocal yokels who are sure to draw a crowd. They can fashion a rebuttal that's as subtle as a sword, but they will never scuttle the word of the Lord. And this idea that there's all kinds of arguments against it. And I look at someone like Mother Teresa or St. Francis. You can argue everything about their lives, okay? And I thank God I didn't have their vocation. But the fact of the matter is you can't deny how happy they were. You look at these people in these different circumstances that we would find just, I think of like Maximilian Kolbe in Auschwitz. In the horrible suffering that everyone was going through, who would think of another person? I mean, you were lucky to get through your day alive, period. But he was willing to see the other person, change places and so forth. But just remarkable, people find happiness in pursuit, in the most horrible of situations, in this pursuit. But again, I think we have to really be strong on the idea that religion is not a matter of what we give up or a matter of prohibitions. He says, awake, awake, clothe yourself in strength, arm of the Lord. And this is us calling on God now. He goes into this. He says, so we call God to be awake. There was a woman in San Diego, taught at the University of California in La Jolla, and she is the world's expert on atheism in philosophy. And her theory, basically, she has whole year-long course, and lots of people go to the course. I found it fascinating to listen to her. But she says that there's basically three things. She says that we teach God is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. And she says if God is those three things, then God doesn't exist. Because either he doesn't know what's going on, he's not powerful enough to change it, or he's a rotten person. One of the three. And so it's really interesting the way she develops this in the class. I find it fascinating. But this idea of, we oftentimes have the feeling that God isn't paying close attention. So this idea of awake. It says, awake as in former days, generations long ago. And this idea is, he was awakened when we, in fact, were slaves in Egypt. He was awakened, and he delivered us out of slavery in Egypt. He says, was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces and who pierced the dragon through? The Jews, like all people at the time, had legends about great sea animals. And one of the great sea animals was Rahab, which is, in fact, a dragon. Now, I think you know that the prostitute in Jericho was also named Rahab. But the word Rahab means dragon. And when they talk about being cut in pieces and run through, they're talking about the dragon, that the dragon was slayed. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a road for the redeemed to walk? And it was the idea that God opened the Red Sea for the Jews to go through, more correctly, the Reed Sea. but he opened the sea for the Jews to go through as part of the Exodus. He said, the redeemed of the Lord will return. They will enter Zion shouting for joy, crowned with joy everlasting. And this idea of I think one of the more interesting things with regards to history is that when that great famine occurred in Ethiopia many years ago, a large community of Ethiopians claimed to be Jewish and asked to go to Israel. If you have Jewish blood, you have a right to go to Israel under their laws. And so the people in Israel basically didn't believe them. They thought they were, just trying to get out of the famine, which I certainly would understand. But they did the DNA on them, and they were all Jewish. They all had Jewish blood. And where that came from is in the time of the Babylonian captivity. When the Jews were being taken to Babylon, a group of the Jews escaped and went over to, Ethiopia. They went basically to Egypt. And then some of them went into Ethiopia, and the ones in Egypt ultimately were enslaved. But the thing that I think is interesting, it says, the redeemed of the Lord will return, and they will enter Zion shouting for joy. And the fact of the matter is, this is a promise from God. But that thing about the Ethiopians, we do not even know where the redeemed are. Like if I were to say, we'll gather all the Jews anywhere, I wouldn't know where to find them. I know people who profess to be Jewish. I know a lot of people who are Jewish who don't profess to be Jewish. And I know a lot of people who are Jewish and don't know they are Jewish. And I mentioned Madeleine Albright. When Madeleine Albright visited Israel as Secretary of State, she discovered she was Jewish. She escaped as a little tiny child, and her parents didn't escape with her. She escaped and was raised by a family in Spain and thought in her life that she was a Spanish Catholic. But she, in fact, was, Jewish ancestry. So this idea that God will find them and draw them all together. He says, joy and gladness will come upon them, and sorrow and sighing will take flight. And I think one of the things that is interesting when we think about this is that how quickly our attitude can change. Just instantaneously, our attitude can change. I think of when I was going through the initial thing of the cancer, I went in for a surgery and came out. That usually solves the cancer I have. And 1 month later, I had to go in for surgery again. And it should have been solved the first time. But then 1 month, I had to go in again. And this time they did the third surgery and gave me chemo. And 1 month later, I had to go in for another surgery. I came out, another chemo. And then 1 month later, I went, and they said there's no cancer. So for a full year, I went every month, and there was no cancer. So then the next year, I went every 3 months, and there was no cancer. Next year, I went every 6 months, and then I go once a year now, and I haven't had any cancer for 17 years. But after that first series, where every month I went in, I think that when I went in, I expected they would find the things, because they had the preceding 5 times. So I'm sitting there, the doctor says, there's no cancer at all. My attitude changed instantaneously. And I think this is what God's talking about. God's ability to change the way we think and to change the attitude we have at any time is absolutely remarkable. And in the scripture, it's always compared to the same thing. It's always compared to the fact of a woman giving birth to a baby, the suffering involved in delivering the child. in contrasted to when you first hold the child. They hand the child, healthy child, to you after the birth. It's a very different thing. And this idea that God says, I have the ability to change that. I can say one thing to you, like no cancer, and your whole world changes. And we trust God's ability to do that at any time about anything that goes on. I haven't got a good track of the time. Or we'll take a few more verses then. He says, and this is God speaking, he says, I am your counselor. And this rather consoler. And this idea that God is the one beside us who takes care of this. And so he says, you're really supposed to be looking for me, to make you happy, and this sort of thing. He says, why then fear human beings who are doomed to death, a child of man whose fate is that of the grass? And this idea of being afraid, I think you know that the power that evil has in the world is threatening death. That has always been true, and that's true today. What evil does is threaten death. But that's the amazing treasure that you and I as believers hold, that Jesus Christ has told us we will rise from the dead. So no one should be able to threaten us with death. We are only threatened to the degree that we don't believe that. But if I honestly believe that I will rise from the dead, then you can't threaten me with death. You know, it's like threatening someone with an unloaded gun. You just can't be threatened by it. So he said, you forget the Lord who made you, who spread out the heavens and laid the earth's foundations. Constantly, all day long, you fear the fury of the oppressor bent on destruction. He says, you forget the Lord who created life, and you're afraid of the one who thinks he can destroy it. But should he destroy it, this is still the Lord who created life out of nothing. So what's the deal? He says, where now is the fury of the oppressor? Very soon shall the cowering captive be set free, not going down to the pit and to death, and not starved of food. And so he says that very shortly, the thing will change. It goes over. He says, I am the Lord your God, who stirs up the sea, making its waves roar. I think I've told you before that the seas were terrifying to the Jews. They had all these stories about these animals, like Rahab, and Rahab and the story of the dragon, all that comes from crocodiles when they were in Egypt. And these things, but the seas were ruled by the Phoenicians, who incidentally, the Philistines are descendants of the Phoenician colonies that they put along the coast. And so the Jews stayed away from the ocean. If you go to Israel today, the major port is Haifa, but the only port they had in the days of Jesus was Joppa, which is modern-day Tel Aviv. And it's not really a big port. It's like a beach you pull up on. But there, you could enter Israel by sea there. But people didn't enter Israel by sea. They went down the Via Mare. It's a road that runs clear around the Mediterranean. And they stayed away from the water. He says, the Lord Sabaoth is my name. I put my words into your mouth. I hide you in the shadow of my hand. I spread out the heavens. I lay earth's foundations. And I say to Zion, you are my people. So the idea that he says, I'm in charge of the heavens, I'm in charge of the earth, I give you my law, and I tell you, you're my people. If you're my people, you have nothing to fear. I'm the one who takes care of you. Okay, we'll call it there, and that's chapter 51, verse 17.